Can the Vancouver Canucks be better than the Los Angeles Kings next season? That's one of the topics that's going to come up on this episode of Locked On Canucks.
You're Locked On Canucks, your daily podcast on the Vancouver Canucks.
We continue our countdown to the 2023-24 NHL season, and we continue our look at our Pacific Division rivals with the Vancouver Canucks. We'll be joined by Locked On Canucks co-host Trevor Beggs on this edition of Locked On LA Kings.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Kings. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Kings fans, welcome to Locked On LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked On LA Kings your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love for you to leave us a positive comment on Apple Podcasts if you're a fan of the show. And of course, we're on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you're enjoying this content. I'm Eddie Garcia, your host of Locked On LA Kings. I work in sports media for the past 30 years, 20 plus years at the Fox Sports Radio Network. I'm also co-host of the Puck Podcast. It's a weekly NHL review show that's been putting out content for the past 17 years. And of course, a passionate LA Kings fan for 30 years. Today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that can treat over 500 infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's Jase medical.com. We continue to preview our rivals in the Pacific Division, and joining us to talk about the Vancouver Canucks for the first time, we are welcoming in Trevor Beggs. You can follow him on Twitter at Trev Beggs, and you can follow Locked On Canucks at Locked On Canucks. Trevor, good to talk to you for the first time, and thanks for joining us.
Eddie, pleasure to be on the show. And your Kings, they got a nice little trajectory they're on right now. I'm a little bit jealous.
Well, we're definitely going to get your opinion on that, and that's good to hear. Hopefully you're right. But for those that don't follow the Canucks closely, I did want to ask you kind of about the state of the organization, because in the last couple seasons, there's been a lot going on off the ice with this team, from the owner being sued by his estranged children. There's been front office shakeup, new general manager, a new head coach who's going into his first full season. So the front office and looking at the organization, are things settled? Do you feel like things are kind of on solid ground going into this season?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of yes and no there. You mentioned Francesco Aquilini off the top there. The owner of the Canucks. I think there's always nonstop drama with him and that family. And that family's been through scandal after scandal in terms of his children coming after him and other malpractice with other business they've owned. So I think with Aquilini at the top, there's always a sense of being on edge and not knowing what to expect with this organization. That being said, since they've cleaned house in terms of their GM, their coach, this season kind of falls on the players, right? I think there is that stability and structure in place with Alvin and Rutherford. And last season, although there was some hope, clearly Boudreau was not their guy. And they made that very evident, months before he got fired, which, kind of led to all of the drama in Vancouver last season. But now that they have their guy in place and Rick Tocchet, there's really no excuses anymore. That being said, I don't think you could right the ship overnight. I think on paper, the Canucks are still probably a wild card team at best. But there's steps that there's more stability than there's been in past years, but it's certainly not all gone, I'd say.
Well, the Canucks are on their third head coach in 3 seasons. You mentioned Rick Tocchet. They had Bruce Boudreau come in late in the season, taking over for Travis Green, and things looked like they were going in the right direction. And then last season, he starts as head coach, and it doesn't go well. Didn't get off to a good start, and then they decide to make another coaching change. They bring in Rick Tocchet late in the year, and then the team seemed to play better under him. But he's now going into his first full season as head coach of the Canucks. So are you optimistic that they've now found the right coach to get him where they want to be?
Yeah, I have tepid optimism. We'll call it that. I mean, there's a sense of, things have gone so wrong in Vancouver for, basically a decade now that I think you're always a bit on edge about what's going to happen with this team. That being said, I thought some of the end of season interviews were very telling. I know Ethan Bear, now former Canucks defenseman, talked about how when he got traded from Carolina to Vancouver, he was utterly shocked about how disorganized the Canucks were defensively. Coming from Carolina where everything was very structured, very rigid, it kind of felt like every man for himself in Vancouver under Boudreau. And that kind of lines up with what we heard from Rutherford, from day one of training camp. He wasn't impressed with how the Canucks started training camp under Boudreau. So despite all this optimism and Boudreau being one of the most winningest coaches of all time, it just didn't work in Vancouver. And I think it was evident it wasn't going to work. So, despite all that controversy about him being fired, it probably was the right call, even if they didn't quite handle it the right way. With Rick Tocchet, I think the optimism comes from the fact that there's more structure in place. They played like more of a structured team last season. He's really kind of on them about fitness and like starting right. Whereas I think last season under Boudreau was a little bit more happy-go-lucky. That being said, the Canucks had one of the softest schedules in the league last season after Tocchet took over, so I don't want to take too much away from that sample size either. So I'm firmly in wait-and-see mode. I think there's always optimism this time of year, but we've seen in Vancouver time and time again, things go off the rails pretty quick.
I was trying to look at some connections between the Kings and Canucks, and I know that, and you probably know, the Kings have had some issues in net, and they're kind of still looking to solidify that. And there was some talk about maybe getting SoCal native Thatcher Demko from the Canucks in a trade. I never really bought into that, to be honest with you. I think the Canucks want to build around Demko, Elias Pettersson, and their young standout defenseman, Quinn Hughes, who they just named captain. That was the big news on your show this week. But it seems like this season could go a long way in figuring out which way they want to go. If they can get on solid ground, if Tocchet looks like he's the right guy and they either, make the playoffs or are fighting for a playoff spot late in the year, maybe that's to signal to ownership that, okay, we've got this good core to build around going forward. But if not, if they falter, if they don't have a good season, then maybe they decide to go in the way of a rebuild, because it seems like they're kind of in the middle right now. Would you agree? They're not in a rebuild, but they're not really all in as well. They're kind of trying to figure it out at this point.
Yeah, and I think Jim Rutherford talked about turning this thing around pretty quickly. So I think they're certainly not in a rebuild. I think a rebuild would maybe be constituted by Elias Pettersson not signing an extension, right? That is the doomsday scenario in Vancouver, is that they have another bad season and Pettersson walks. I know he's an RFA, but forces his way out in some regard. That would certainly help kickstart a rebuild. That being said, I think much like the Kings had during their run with Kopitar, Doughty, and Quick, the Canucks have their pillars in place. They have Pettersson, Hughes, and Demko, who are arguably three of the best players at their position in the NHL. A bit more questions about Demko after last season, but I think when he's on and when he's healthy, he's played like one of the best goalies in hockey. So it's definitely been a lot of tinkering around the edges this offseason. I'm not quite sure if it's going to pay off. I'm still quite worried about the Canucks defense, but definitely in that mushy middle, but moving towards trying to contend rather than trying to rebuild.
We're going to talk more later on in the show about what you think about the Pacific Division. But just what are some keys? What are some things that have to fall into place in your mind for the Canucks to be in a playoff hunt for this coming season?
Yeah, I think you mentioned probably the biggest X factor on the Canucks, or I'd say the most important player on the Canucks, and that's Thatcher Demko. I think with Pettersson and Hughes, you expect them to be two of the best players at their position in the NHL. With Thatcher Demko, like I said, he's been in a Vezina pace before, or in that conversation. And he's really only been a starter now for 2.5 seasons, right? He took over Braden Holtby, which sounds ludicrous to say out loud, midway through that 2020-21 shortened season there. But he's really only been a starter for 2.5 years. And most of last year he was injured and started slow before that. But I think, I've been a big fan of Demko since before he even entered the NHL, from what he did in university to what he did in Utica. I think he's got the right mentality to play the position. I think he's structurally very sound at being a good goaltender. So I'd say Demko is the biggest X factor. And aside from that, the Canucks, if they even have an average penalty kill, they're going to be in a better spot. They almost stole the Kings record of having the most putrid penalty kill in NHL history last season. And then when you look at where they were in the standings, it's like if they had an average penalty kill, they probably would have made the playoffs. So to me, those are the two biggest X factors. You expect the Canucks to score more. You expect them to be more structured. It's more so, can Demko be the Demko of old, and can the penalty kill go from absolutely horrid to just even average?
All right, so we've learned a little bit about the Canucks. Up next, we're going to find out what Trevor thinks about our LA Kings. We'll do that next on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Hey, today's episode of Locked On LA Kings brought to you by Jace Medical, who provides a product called the Jace Case. They can supply you with 5 life-saving antibiotics in case of emergency. All you have to do is fill out a simple form online. In some cases, make a quick call to their board-certified physicians to be prepared with antibiotics in case of an emergency. You can also get ongoing care from their physicians on any treatment-related questions. Don't get caught unprepared. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. Jace handles everything from online evaluations to licensed pharmacy medication delivery and ongoing consultation and care. Save more than $360 by getting these life-saving antibiotics with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off using my code Locked On. That is jacemedical.com, JASE medical.com.
People, before we get back to the show, baby, I gotta tell you that new episodes of Locked On Canucks will be available wherever you stream podcasts and on YouTube at 4:20 p.m. for no reason at all, okay? New episodes every day at 4:20 p.m. Again, wherever you stream podcasts and on YouTube. Let's get back to the show.
By the way, there will be no episode tomorrow unless there is breaking news or we get bored of our families and loved ones. Enjoy your Friday and take care of yourself.
We've got more with Trevor Biggs, the co-host of Locked On Canucks, and time to get his thoughts on our LA Kings. And I'm going to sound like I'm trolling here. I'm not trying to, but when I think of Canucks Kings, the first thing that pops into my mind as a Kings fan was, of course, the playoffs in 2012, the Dustin Brown hit on Henrik Sedin, little captain on captain hit there. The Kings upset the President's Trophy winners and go on to win their first ever Stanley Cup. When you think Kings Canucks historically or otherwise, what's kind of the first thing that comes into your head?
I think some of I lean positive first, right? So I think for me, I believe it was 2009 or 2010. I think it was 2010 where they beat the Kings in 6 games. And, for me, that was a great series win against a scrappy Kings team. I also think Alex Edler, just because you guys stole what was, arguably the best defenseman in Canucks history, although I would say it's been Quinn Hughes since, he entered the league in 2018. But a lot of people still think Edler is the greatest defenseman in Canucks history, which is a bit of a sad indictment on our organization, I'd say. But, I also think about 2012 too, right? And it's a painful memory. So for me personally, I was at game 1 at Rogers Arena. It was the only playoff game as a fan I've been to in Rogers Arena. It was game 1, Canucks won the President's Trophy. I'm going nuts. The energy in that building is electric. Like, we think this is going to be our year. Last year we got so close. This is the year to get over the hump. And of course, the Kings come and take care of the Canucks in short order. So, I mean, for a while now, it's with the Canucks being bad and the Kings contending, it's, the Kings have gotten the better of the Canucks. So for me, when I think of Canucks Kings, it's a bit of jealousy for sure.
Yeah, believe me, that year was unexpected for you. It was unexpected for us as well, as going in as that 8 seed and winning it all. Just goes to show you in the Stanley Cup playoffs, get in and you never know what's going to happen. We saw that with Florida this year as well. So the Kings made a big trade in the offseason, maybe the biggest trade in the offseason, second to Erik Karlsson going to Pittsburgh, but they get center Pierre-Luc Dubois from Winnipeg. Thoughts on the trade? Do you see this trade helping the Kings be better than they were last season?
Yeah, I'm still kind of torn on it, to be honest. And maybe I'm a bit of a Pierre-Luc Dubois doubter, but people don't fault the guy because he's like, oh, he was in Columbus and he was in Winnipeg. Like, he should have went out. Those are bad markets. But to me, I see a guy who, really high draft pick, and he's been a bit entitled. And even for Winnipeg in the playoffs, like, he was absolutely putrid. So I don't know. The Kings gave up 2 good players in that trade, and Iafallo, who I think is pretty underrated, and obviously Gabe Vilardi, who was starting to come into his own as well. So I almost look at this trade as maybe a wash. I mean, I think maybe as a Canucks guy, maybe I want to doubt it a bit more than I should. Because at the end of the day, you look at that center depth in LA, and I'm not sure who even matches up in the league, right? It's like Kopitar, Deneau, and Pierre-Luc Dubois. Like, that's insanity down the middle. I'd say it's comparable to what the Canucks had at the beginning of last season with Pettersson, Miller, and Horvat down the middle. So at the end of the day, the Kings, with or without Dubois, are a good team. I think probably underrated in some circles. And honestly, like, even if I think that trade's the wash, I still see the Kings as contending for top spot in the Pacific alongside Edmonton and Vegas.
Is there a player on the LA Kings that, I don't know if you want to say you're a fan of, somebody that you're intrigued by, or somebody that you're really curious to see how they do this coming season?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the player. There's probably a couple guys, but I'll start with the player who shares the same name as me, and that's Trevor Moore. Another underrated player a bit undersized. An undersized guy named Trevor is something I can relate to. So, but I thought it was a really shrewd pickup by the Kings to take him on, right? And I don't even think you guys were expecting it when he had his breakout in 2021-22, but he posts like over half point a game and looked pretty good in the playoffs as well. And kind of proud of him to parlay that into a long-term deal with the Kings as well, despite, because he's an undrafted guy. And I think Vladislav Gavrikov is another guy that I'm really intrigued by on the Kings. I was looking at him as a target for the Canucks if he got to free agency. I think that was one of the bigger holes in this team was left side defense. And, Ian Cole is more of a short-term option there, obviously on a 1-year deal. But I thought Gavrikov, analytics guys don't like him, but every time I watched him in LA, and I think you can attest to this, I was pretty impressed with this play in terms of transitioning and being hard to play against defensively. So kind of curious to see how he's going to perform this season with a full year in LA. He's got that new deal. He's making some big boy dollars now. And yeah, people seem to be pretty torn on him. So that's another guy I have my eye on for sure.
Anything about the Kings that you're impressed with or maybe not impressed with, or just any general thoughts on them as a team right now?
Again, goes back to that jealousy aspect and the fact that, even though you guys won 2 cups, I think there was a quick realization that, the glory days were over and we need to rebuild and reset things. And very quickly, the Kings stockpiled one of the best prospect pools in the league. Now, I'm sure like every team has some draft regrets, but, you look at like Quinton Byfield versus Tim Stützle, for instance. But at the end of the day, I think the Kings have done a fantastic job of retooling quickly, gathering assets, and then turning themselves into a contender again. Now, I don't know if they have that star that's going to put them over the top. So I would argue that star power often matters more in the NHL than depth to an extent. But, at the end of the day, you do have to have some depth. Just look at what Vegas did this season as well. So I've just been impressed with what the Kings have done. And there's jealousy from a Canucks perspective when you've seen an organization under Jim Benning continuously piss away assets, make bad trades, make bad signings, and kind of dig a hole for their team. And the Kings not only avoided that, but really did a good job of retooling on the fly and building the prospect pool and building the future out pretty well.
Well, it sounds like you think the Kings are a playoff team, and I think Kings fans are certainly expecting that as well, trying to make the playoffs for a 3rd straight year, which around here, believe it or not, is not all that common when you look at the history of the Kings recently anyway. But the big story here, or the big storyline here is, okay, we're a playoff team, but are we going to make it out of the first round? 2 years in a row, losing to the Oilers in round number 1. And this year, it certainly seems like, making the playoffs isn't good enough. It's about advancing. And obviously, you don't know what the matchup is going to be. But do you think the Kings are equipped this season to get beyond the first round of the playoffs?
I mean, I'm going to lean no right now. And to me, it falls down to goaltending. I think there's a lot of pieces in LA. I would say probably twofold: goaltending and star power. When you face a team like the Oilers, it's really hard to beat McDavid in a 1-to-1 matchup. It's hard to beat Draisaitl in a 1-to-1 matchup. I mean, automatically in that series, the Edmonton Oilers, in any series, they're going to have the 2 best players. But one reason why you could overcome that would be goaltending. And with Phoenix, Copley, and Cam Talbot, are they really going to overcome that? I don't know. I think goaltending is a wild card for a number of teams. I mentioned it as a wild card for the Canucks. But that being said, I'm much more confident in the Canucks having strong goaltending this season than the LA Kings. I think the Kings got the depth to overcome it, but that's certainly the Achilles heel of the team. So I would say based on goaltending and based on that lack of star power, probably not getting past the first round. Anything can happen, but probably the other big X factor for you guys is, can the young guys step up? Like, can Quinton Byfield step up? Can Arthur Kaliev take another step? Those are kind of the 2 shining jewels that I can think of off the top of my head right now for your team. But if the young guys can step up and they get the goaltending as possible, but I wouldn't bet on that happening right now.
All right. More with Locked On Canucks host Trevor Beggs. We're going to get his thoughts on the Pacific Division as a whole. We'll do it next here on Locked On LA Kings, your team every day. Hey, be sure to check out Locked On NHL. It's your daily show to keep you updated on everything going on around the National Hockey League. It's Locked On NHL on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. Now, Trevor, good stuff. We want to get people's opinions, blunt opinions on the Kings. Don't think they're getting out of the first round. Hopefully that's not the case, but I like to get love the honesty and hearing. That's why we like to have some of the other people on the show to get a unbiased opinion on our team. So appreciate you sharing your thoughts there. Let's get your thoughts on the Pacific Division, which going into last season, a lot of people were dumping on as the worst division in hockey. And they ended up having 4 teams make the playoffs. 3 of those 4 teams advanced. Of course, one of them couldn't because they were going head to head. And unfortunately, that was our Kings going up against the Oilers. But we also had the Stanley Cup winner coming out of the Pacific Division in the Vegas Golden Knights. So how many teams do you think out of the Pacific make the playoffs this year? 3 for sure, of course, but could it see 4 again? Could we even see 5 teams from the Pacific?
I think you could see 5. I mean, I think the Pacific could be the deepest division in hockey. I look at the Pacific Division really in 3 silos right now. I see the Oilers, Golden Knights, and Kings as that, top 3 pretty clearly. But in that second tier, I could see any of the Flames, Kraken, or Canucks making some noise, playing above expectations. I could see any of those 3 teams making the playoffs. I mean, the Flames are probably the team I'm the most down on of that group. But the Flames, and I think a lot of people I talk to feel this way. Every time you think the Flames are going to be bad, they're good. And every time you think they're going to be good, they're bad. And right now it looks like they're not going to be very good next season. So I think they're going to probably surprise a lot of people. And, with the Canucks, I just don't think it could be much worse, to be honest. I think the talent is there. I think the depth is now there. It's certainly a belief that Talk is going to improve things and Demko is going to bounce back to form. But if I was betting right now, I'd have the Canucks as a wild card team, although I think it's a bit of a coin flip. And with the Kraken, it's almost you reverse the Canucks. I think they had a lot of good luck last season. And now, going into, this upcoming season, I think maybe some of that luck might be about to run out. But at the end of the day, I could easily see 5 teams from the Pacific making the playoffs. I think it's arguably the deepest division in hockey.
Your thoughts on who might win the division?
Yeah, right now, really hard to bet against Vegas. I think you're going to see a motivated Edmonton Oilers team. So I'm probably leaning towards the Oilers right now. That being said, it's like, how much better can McDavid get? I don't want to bet against the guy, but after what he did last season, there can't be that much of a higher gear, can there? But at the end of the day, I think the Oilers are going to be pretty motivated in some of those divisional matchups to bring their A game. They almost won the division last year. It ended up being a coin flip between the Golden Knights and the Oilers. I'd love to give you a bold pick here and say it's going to be the Kings. You say it's going to be the Canucks, but I think it's probably going to be the Oilers again.
And which team do you think could be maybe the Kraken of this season? A team that really surprises and kind of comes out of nowhere, because there's always a few teams right in the NHL that really defy the odds and nobody saw this coming. Anyone in the Pacific you think could be that team this year?
Yeah, I don't think on the Kraken's level, no, because that would be like Anaheim or San Jose making the jump. San Jose is obviously not making the jump. There's zero chance that team's going to be the next Kraken. The Ducks got a slightly better chance, albeit not that much of a better chance of making that leap. I think it's got to come from one of the Flames, the Kraken again, or the Canucks. And my homer bias wants me to say it's going to be the Canucks, to be honest with you.
I don't blame you, man. I don't blame you. Certainly, I'm with you. I think Vancouver certainly could be that 5th team, maybe that 4th team. Calgary is a big question mark. I know some people are like, well, Daryl Sutter's out now. You've got, fresh GM, new coach, breath of fresh air in that organization, but they lose Tyler Toffoli, their leading scorer again. Is Jacob Markstrom going to bounce back? So there's a lot of question marks there as well. So I think if there is going to be one team other than the 4 that made it in from last season, I would pick the Vancouver Canucks. So it'll be very interesting to see how your Canucks do this year. That is Trevor Beggs. He is the co-host of Locked On Canucks. Check out his podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Obviously doing a great job this season covering the Vancouver Canucks along with his co-host Kyle Bowen. Thank you so much, Trevor. It was great to meet you. Good luck this season. I'm sure we'll have you on again at some point during the season to find out what's going on with the Canucks. Certainly when the Canucks and Kings go head to head, maybe we'll have a little crossover preview as well. But good stuff. Really appreciate all the information. And we enjoyed having you on today. Thank you.
I appreciate it, Eddie. All the best to you.
All right. That is, again, Trevor Beggs, the co-host of Locked On Canucks. We appreciate his time. As we wrap up the show, I want to remind you, everydayers, don't forget that coming up on Friday, we have our annual Kings feedback show. All your questions, all your comments on anything going on with the LA Kings, as a rookie camp is going to be opening up here soon. We've got the rookie tournament going on in Las Vegas as well. Those games will be getting underway. We'll be talking about that. If you want to send an email, it is lockedoneddie@gmail.com, EDDIE. And as always, you can leave your comments if you're watching on YouTube down below. We'd love for you to stay interactive with the show by following us on Twitter and Instagram. We are at Locked on LA Kings. I'm Eddie Garcia. Thank you for listening and watching this episode of Locked on LA Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. And as always, go Kings.